again. Uh, After having an intense discussion, or let's say developing a foreground on who is an entrepreneur and what is entrepreneurship largely, we tend to, or we should be looking towards the picture which entrepreneurs should visualize, and that is where we would understand that how an entrepreneur should behave, or let us say what actually entrepreneurship is, and that can this thought can be kind of solidified, or let us say structured more if we tend to look at entrepreneurship with the perspective of design thinking. And this is a very elaborate kind of a subject, but I would try to converge it within a certain frame of thought by pondering slightly upon what is design thinking and entrepreneurship, or both of these things together kind of. As I said, that entrepreneur actually visualizes things, analyze, and puts up a picture together that, if one looks at, is associated with having an intent and realizing that intent. So and that is what design thinking is. When you are looking at a larger picture, when you are looking at that picture with the perspective of this end to that end, when you are trying to generate a sequence, when you are trying to generate a harmony between the elements you are trying to put up together, when you are trying to generate a rhythm, when you are foreseeing an end result in terms of intense productivity, growth, and a sort of a self-propelled system, then it is termed as design thinking actually, and that is the reflection of, or that constitutes or constituted by, vice versa, by entrepreneurship as well. Now how does it happen? As I said that I would be using some examples to elaborate upon this, but as I was discussing about Tatas, so let me carry forward from that example, which would make our discussion sort of synchronized with our previous discussion. Jamshedji, when if you look at the history of such organizations, and that is not the only organization which has to be looked upon with this kind of a perspective, there are several other organizations, but this organization, because has a peculiar characteristic of entering into businesses foreseeably playing a particular kind of a role in societal and national development, one, and then that too with an organizational structure associated or supported by largely by trusts, and constituting largely trusts, not generating revenue for individual benefits, but again to be propelled back in for the societal trusts, societal development, sorry. Patanjali is also tending to go for the similar kind of thing. They have not for profit companies as well as trusts catering to their as far as their businesses go in many of the cases. So Tatas, when they were thinking in terms of, or Jamshedji when he was thinking in terms of what to initiate, from where to initiate, how is it to be done, when after his initial experience of going to London for trading cotton, when he came back to India, by the time he had an exposure of producing cotton, manufacturing yarn and textile and those kind of, and then he had already visited mills in Manchester, wherein he not only noticed the technology which was supporting those ventures, but also noticed that those places were not actually taking good care of their workforce, the environment of working was not so conducive and so on. So he could notice this as well. When he comes back to India, he develops or organizes a mill in Maharashtra, wherein he was not only thinking in terms of producing a product, but also infusing the best of the technology, best of the infrastructure, and the most conducive working environment along with the best of the human resource policies. Just to quote an example, at that time his mill and organization had a working mother's creche for the children, small children of the ladies who used to work there. And then lots of good human resource policies which were yet to be seen by the world, and especially this part of the world, were introduced by Tatas at that time. So now looking at the larger picture, this is one, and where would that product go, and who would buy that product, and who would be the people who would be associated with that product, and so on. That is one part when we look at one venture. But he was looking for a diversified and integrated kind of a venture, wherein he was looking for several businesses to be integrated into one, or supporting each other, or contributing in national development at large at least. So then he thought of steel, power, education, chemicals, and several businesses which could be associated with each other, as well as a common goal for national development through human resource development, and through customer development, and through partner development, and so on. And when I get to learn that so many key partners which Tatas have been having are going with them generationally, and they have lots of high levels of customer loyalty as well as employee loyalty and employee retention, which they are proud of. So that is a perspective associated with an integration of all the elements in such a fashion, so that they fit in and gel into with each other at large, and that is what we call design thinking, and that is what we call entrepreneurship as well, when we look at it with the perspective of generating benefits for all. It is entrepreneurship. When we look at it with creating a larger picture, well synchronized, elements of the picture well synchronized with each other, we call it design thinking, or we may call it design thinking. So now what is how to organize for this intent? You can organize for an intent, for realizing that intent with lots of intent. This looks like a phrase, but it is quite true. Intent can only serve your intent. How does it do what it is supposed to? It does everything with lots of connect, lots of empathy. You see, you are concerned with people, you are concerned with your partners, you are concerned with the objective of the organization, you are concerned with the objective to serve the customers, you are concerned with the customers themselves, you are concerned with retaining everyone within that picture, and then adding on people while you grow, while that organization particularly grows. So your connect and intensity and your concern leads to where you would go. How does it happen? It happens with reflexivity. Reflexivity is not only a mode of getting thoughts from people and associating your thoughts with people. Reflexivity is not only a mode of conducting research. Reflexivity is not only a mode of propelling design thinking. Reflexivity is central to all the elements what humans does. Reflexivity is central to the connect you would generate at the end of the day. Reflexivity can be defined in terms of when you hold an infant in your hands and you look into the eyes of the infant. At that particular moment, if you smile, the infant would smile. If you cry, the infant would cry. That is where reflexivity is. Reflexivity is associated with where a mother doesn't have to be told that how child is feeling at this particular moment. So reflexivity is associated with that, and reflexivity is associated with intensity as such. Reflexivity is associated with how you foresee that what you would feel if you would be at that side. Reflexivity is associated with reflectivity and reflection as such. So now, let's talk about all these elements which we have discussed in the previous discussion: intent and realization of intent, and design thinking, especially with the reference to entrepreneurship. For example, we take pencils. Now, a basic fundamental product. There is an interesting essay of Reed which says that no one knows how to make pencils. That does not mean that people do not know how to make pencils, but he says that no one knows how to make pencil. That means for producing such a basic product today, we can call it a basic product. For such a simple product, there is an involvement of so many people from so many regions with so many capacities and capabilities. Graphite comes from somewhere, wood comes from somewhere, infusion is done somewhere else, and then someone else utilizes that, and there are several purposes for it, for this product to be utilized. And sometimes we overlook such kind of products because they become so much the part of our lives. We stop discussing about such kind of products. But if you look at just surf around on the internet, you would find that there are more than 500 companies who are manufacturing pencils and getting benefited out of that through profits, and then they are synchronizing the complete picture of such a basic and a fundamental product. On the other side, there are technical products like robots. Now you look at the organizations who are producing robots. So they also go through the similar process of associating partners and customers into a synchronized fashion basically, and they also visualize everything with lots of connect and reflexivity, what the robot would do, what kind of roles this robot would play. Someone is producing robots who would be utilized in restaurants, someone is producing robots who are definitely being utilized in manufacturing nowadays, someone is working on micro robots who would be utilizing in human body to support surgical procedures, and so on. Then look at people who, or I should now be calling such people like entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs or people who are developing institutions. Very intense kind of thing basically. I have been associated personally with many institutional development efforts, and many a times I have realized that there is a bankruptcy of thoughts amongst people who are associated with such kind of institutional development exercises, because they can't visualize that why, from where, and how should they bring in human resource. How should they nurture that human resource? How would they contribute in the development of a faculty who would become a self-reliant and self-propelled individual to be handed over with the responsibility of the students coming to this institution? And then how would you bring in the right kinds of students and provide them the right kind of content with the help of this faculty, and everything becomes synchronized. When the student, as a product goes out, industry receives that student, and he or she plays a pivotal role in that particular organization or industry wherever they go, and then the response level gets enhanced and whole of the cycle keeps on going. It's a very typical kind of thing to be done. Today we have hundreds of universities which have come up recently, thousands of institutions which have come up recently, and still the last report, I do not know what kind of methodology they utilized for suggesting that majority of the students who are coming out from the Indian institutions are not so much employable. I feel this thought very perplexing, that then why we do have such kind of institutions who are not who are unable to produce develop such kind of students who have high level of employability. What is the gap, what is the flaw? So but then the reason lies in design thinking basically. You are creating courses which have present market value, you get admission in those courses, you are able to deliver those courses up till an appropriate level, but then unfortunately it ends up somewhere. We have seen many such courses dying, we have seen many such disciplines receding back, we have seen many students getting obsolete as far as the job market goes and so on. So, the ultimate situation is that there is a huge depleting effect, and the fact is that students are getting are graduating, but still they are either not doing what they are supposed to, or they are not doing anything at all. Then same thing happens with someone when someone develops hospital. Generally we have seen that the doctors, they themselves become entrepreneurs, and they think in terms of providing the kind of ability, that's the services in relation to the abilities they have, the qualifications they have. But then it becomes sort of very specific service based hospital, or let us say specific stream based hospital. But the point is, if someone wants to organize a large hospital, then what is to be done? So, same story and same analogy goes into that situation as well. You have to conceive, but here is a catch. You have to conceive the future ailments as well. You have to conceive the future types of illnesses which might emerge in times to come. The current data would tell you that there are large number of diabetics, or there are large number of people afflicted by the lifestyle diseases, so you tend to go for that kind of a thing. But you have to foresee that what kind of things may emerge later on, so that you may start synchronizing or developing your resources in such kind of a fashion. In education, you can foresee that where economy is moving and what kind of a resource you would be requiring for next 20 years, and that is how you develop the human resource and you tend to generate the courses. But in hospitals, foreseeing illness is kind of very typical. So, and then you look at people who build ships, and for that matter shipyards. How to organize a big shipyard, how to build ships, and for what purpose. Sometimes if you would have gone for some sea cruise, you would realize that what kind of conception of thought or design thinking perspective they would have had at the time when they were conceiving this sea cruise for people. So they thought about a ship which could be associated with that, and then they thought about people who could be associated with that. It's a moving small it's a small city which is moving on the sea basically when you look at these cruises. So how to organize those basically. So that is a thought process wherein every simple single thing has to be included as far as your perspective goes, and everything must find a particular kind of a place, and thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, they get associated with that. Same thing goes with when you produce films basically. So every project has to be dealt with a perspective of design thinking, and that is where you realize at the end of the day, for example, on the first day of when viewers go for viewing movies and you find that it did not do so well as expected, you realize that some flaw occurred when during the course of that design thinking, visualization, and as far as putting things together, intent and realization of intent. So now to just analyze this thing with a larger kind of a perspective, I should enumerate those elements of design thinking and entrepreneurship. The basic element at this moment, which I have just suggested also when I was saying connect, so that is empathy. Now, briefly, I would narrate the story which I referred to in our last discussions. When we were talking of jungle fires, how to put off jungle fires, every year lot many jungle fires they happen in northwestern Himalayan region because of forest bio residue, and especially the pine needles which fall off the pine trees. So it's a story how it happens that we will refer to some other time. But when we were talking of the how to put off those jungle fires, there could have been many ways. There could have been scientific and non-scientific ways. But then, what would those people get out of that who are staying there by just if we just put off those jungle fires somehow? So, can we utilize this thing for the benefit of the people? How did it occur to us? We straight away went to people. We started talking to people. We started communicating with people, and as I said, reflexivity started working there. We got connected to the people, and we started brainstorming with so many villagers and people all around, and we started gathering their views about Himalayas, northwestern Himalayas, their place of stay, the characteristics of those beautiful places, their life there, how did they spend generations there, and so on, how they have synchronized themselves with the nature there, and so on. So, after a particular stage of discussions and deliberations which were resultant of empathy, ideas started flowing in, that this forest bioresidue can give birth to a very large sequential situation of generating energy and subsequently livelihood, which can propel a different phase of the life there of people there itself. I would be exaggerating if I say that this would reduce the migration levels, but one can foresee that as well. One can foresee a social change with the help of a simple idea which is associated with converting that forest bioresidue into energy. So, if this simple idea of converting that forest bioresidue into energy, somehow forest bioresidue into energy, this idea can be propelled, then it might instigate so many socio-economic and entrepreneurial effects which might change the economy of whole of the northwestern Himalayas, if one can foresee and look at the situation that way. So, I would be elaborating a lot about this kind of an effort which we made, and to tell you it's at a very advanced stage now, and quite a prominent stage from where it can go towards satisfying its objectives of generating energy through forest bioresidue and changing the socio-economic scenario of that place. So, that is where empathy plays a particular kind of a role in generating an idea. Then it comes to prototype, and prototype goes for testing, and testing goes for a product or a process, and then that product and a process it associates people from both the sides, the partners, the beneficiaries or the customers, and the employees and the organization, and sometimes the industry led by that organization flourishes. And this is how we can say that design thinking gets converted into entrepreneurship. Thank you for now.